LiSTNR production.
Just a warning before we get into this episode, today's deep dive discusses disordered eating. If you need help or support for an eating disorder or body image issue, please call Butterfly's national helpline on 1-800-334-673. Hi, Helen Smith here. Welcome to The Briefing. Today, we want to talk to you about lifting heavy. Getting big and bulky, feeling comfortable enough to pick up a barbell in a gym, and training for muscle gain and strength has been a man's game for a long time. And for many women and female presenting people, the weightlifting section at your local gym wasn't a safe place not that long ago. But in 2024, it's women who are leading the charge and entering the world of bodybuilding. In gyms, in clubs, in homes, women have been, in increasing numbers, picking up weights. There's been a 20% increase in female participation in competitive lifting and bodybuilding events in the US. And here in Australia, there are now more female competitors than males in a range of comps. However, bodybuilding often carries a stigma, seen by many as taking healthy fitness routines to an unhealthy extreme. But is this true? What is it really like to become a bodybuilder? And is the growth in a sport that can be empowering or problematic, depending on who you talk to, a good thing overall? Listener journo Ed Gooden went deep into the world of bodybuilding and got an understanding of why women are starting bodybuilding and whether the skeptics are right. Ed, welcome to The Briefing. Is it true to say that bodybuilding and lifting heavy is on the rise for women?
I think we definitely can. As you mentioned off the top there's a bit of data to back it up in the US. In Australia, the data's a little bit more anecdotally based. So I kind of went on a bit of a deep dive and ruined my Google AdSense and just called every single gym and personal trainer and spoke to everybody at the gym essentially to ask them, are there more women lifting weights and bodybuilding that you've noticed? And the conclusive answer was yes. So a lot of people I spoke to started in the gym back in the 90s, and the extreme levels of gender disparity back then was just next level. We're talking 90-10 splits. And then kind of the second wave came in the late 2010s, and a lot of people who started then were saying that it was, another extreme even after then. So yeah, conclusively based on my research, we can say that they have.
Yeah, I've definitely been seeing it more on my social media, and I have friends who actually have been competitive bodybuilders as well. But let's have a look at some more of those numbers in the sport as a whole. You said just before it's often seen as this male-dominated industry.
Yeah, that's right. And someone I spoke to kind of get a better insight into this is Michael Trimboli. He's one of the founders of Natural Bodybuilding Australia. And annoyingly, their acronym is the NBA, which I probably question why they chose to do that. But he says it's actually one of the greatest misconceptions in bodybuilding.
I think now, in this day and age, the misconception is that it's a male-dominated sport, but it's actually a female-dominated sport. There's more female competitors than there are males.
Wow, that's actually really interesting. I didn't think it would have flipped that quickly in such a short amount of time. Are there any other misconceptions that there may be about female bodybuilding?
Yeah, so one of the ones that gets thrown around a lot is that female bodybuilding is an overtly sexual thing. So, obviously you've got women going up on stage in bikinis, in swimwear, and being judged. And when you've got this conception that it's a heavily male-dominated sport, you also assume that a lot of the judges are male as well. So you've got this very clear picture of what people think is a sexualized thing. But it's something that Michael and then also a bodybuilder called Emily that I spoke to are really passionate about rebuffing. Do you think that female bodybuilding is an inherently sexual thing?
No, I definitely don't think so at all. And I don't think any of the judges would think of it that way either. Like, it's about curves because it's about big, broad shoulders and big lats that taper into a small waist. But being a little bit sultry is about good stage presence, which is captivating. And you're trying to captivate their attention. It's the same you wear a sparkly bikini because you're trying to get their attention. I
understand the reasons why people would think that, because they're not wearing much clothes and you're looking at their physique and they're probably thinking, okay. And that's the same with coaches or most coaches are male, predominantly male, and they coach a lot of females, and they'll get the remarks from their friends, oh, you're working with a lot of hot oh yeah, and it's like, it's not even like that at all. Like our mind doesn't even go there at all because we're professionals, but also it's not what the sport's about.
That's really interesting, the point that she made about why the bikinis are sparkly and I guess almost like a costume. And I grew up doing competitive dance, which you also are kind of judged on your body. I do think, though, that it can't not be sexualized in some way to a point when you are judging your physique. You're judging what you actually look like, not what you can do with your body, unlike other sports. You're judging how it looks. So is that aspect of body image and how it really looks, does that play into the sport at all?
I think it has to. I would agree. I'm also a layperson in this capacity. A lot of the people I spoke to, they were passionate about rebuffing it. They spoke about the bikinis as more of a vessel for people to see the physique. So you've got different categories that we'll talk about later where you've got swimwear and you've got swimsuits. And then in the males, you've got, trunks and Speedos and those types of things. They're almost used as a tool to show off different types of physiques. But I can also 100% see that view as well.
So are there any other potential misconceptions of how dangerous the sport can be? Can bodybuilding be dangerous for your body?
Yeah, so this is actually probably an accurate assumption. There's a lot of data to back this up as well. So there was a study done in the US where women who were competing in sports that were aesthetic based, so you're looking at bodybuilding, you mentioned competitive dance, there's figure skating as well, they're at a 50% higher chance of developing an eating disorder. And that's a pretty damning statistic. And somebody I spoke to from Evolve Training Systems in Melbourne, David, he went as far as to say that there's an epidemic of eating disorders within the female bodybuilding community in Australia. I asked Michael about whether he's noticed unhealthy relationships with food and whether they're common as well.
It is for those people that are potentially getting into the sport for the wrong reasons and their why is wrong, or not wrong, but they don't have the right why. They're not doing it for, to be competitive, to see how far they can push themselves, and to see what they can actually achieve. They're more so doing it for aesthetics, likes, follows, photos, those kind of things. And they'll find that to get to where you need to be for stage is incredibly hard. And if you're not doing it for the right reasons, you can go down and fall into a hole where you might have issues with eating after that point.
Why do you think bodybuilding has then become so popular? Because I read that there as to the why people are doing it. There is this unhealthy kind of reason sometimes that might be behind it with social media. Do we know why it's become so popular, even though it has been deemed dangerous?
Yeah, that's a good question. And there's kind of two waves of bodybuilding popularity that came through. So the 1990s or early 2000s, we saw a slight tweak to the rules for female bodybuilding. So before then, they had two categories, which was figure and physique. Now, figure and physique in the male version of bodybuilding is just all about getting as ripped and massive as you possibly can. So they're looking at everything, every part of you, and you're just trying to get as big as possible. So back then, for women getting involved in that, to get as big as they needed to be to compete, you needed to take performing-enhancing drugs a lot of the time. So it was not an accessible sport at all. But in the early 2000s, they introduced some new categories. They called them feminine categories, which were bikini, figure, fitness, and bodybuilding as well. So I won't get into the specifics of what these actually mean, but it essentially just made it a lot more accessible for women to jump in. The other wave came in the early 2010s when Instagram and Twitter and all those things came to be, and it just made information so much more accessible. So you're able to jump online. You didn't have to talk to the random dude or girl at the gym and being like, how'd you get so jacked? Like, how'd you do this? How'd you do that? You could just get involved. Those were the major two big things that everyone I spoke to said was the reason why.
Yeah, so it seems like social media has had a big impact on the growth of the sport. And in my eyes, then social media and body dysmorphia are kind of intertwined there. You mentioned before that women who do bodybuilding or, competitive sports like dancing and figure skating are twice as likely to develop an eating disorder. Are there any ways that women can avoid this, that it can be done in a healthy way?
I mean, look, that statistic is pretty damning and it's a pretty scary one for anyone wanting to get into female bodybuilding. Michael Trimboli, who I spoke to, he had a way of getting around it. It's essentially just to be as professional as you possibly can.
Phases of being healthy, putting on weight, trying to perform very well, have good amount of energy, and eating a lot of food, right? But then also there's a phase where you need to get ready for the show, and that could be 25 weeks or 20 weeks, depending on how lean you need to get, where you are in a structured way starving yourself, let's just call it that, right? And then the first thing you do as soon as you finish the show, you need to come out of that situation, right? So I would say if you're being coached by the right person, it can be healthier, I'm not saying healthy, healthier than some other fat loss diets that people do. Because it's structured, it's meticulous, you get to a position where you're doing it for a purpose and then you get out of there. You don't try to stay lean and in that, let's call it an unhealthy look, right? We want to get straight out of there. So you're doing it for a purpose where some people, they won't have any structure, they will try to just starve themselves and they'll try to stay there. And that's when they become really, really unhealthy and also have an unhealthy relationship with food.
The words that just jumped out to me there was starving yourself.
Yeah.
For 25 to 20 weeks, that's a long time. I find that really problematic. How does this work? What does the reality look like of someone who is, as Michael said, starving themselves? What's the daily routine?
It varies from person to person, but it is an extreme. That's really the only word you can describe it as. So I spoke to Emily and 5 weeks from her show, which she was going into, she weighed 64 kilos and her goal before the show was to get to 57. So that's 7 kilos to lose in 5 weeks, and 64 kilos is already a weight that, she was already in a very lean space at that time. And then when you get to comp day, you have to do some even more intensive stuff.
Show day, of course. I've been awake since 5 a.m, and I've been here since about 8, I think, to get my hair and makeup done. And then it's flown so quickly because it's tan, touch-ups, check in with my posing coach, check in with my coach, eating my carbs at different times. And I had to chew on all these salt tablets, which was revolting, but it's part of the process. It made me feel so ill, but that's okay. And now I've just had a bunch of lollies to get some carbs in my system super quick, which will help with me pump up my muscles. So I'm just about to do my pump up exercises, which is mainly some raises for my delts and some kickbacks and abductor exercises with a bunch of elastic bands. And then I'll be waiting downstairs to go on stage.
So that's a lot of effort, and that is a lot of dedication and hard work putting into just a few minutes on stage. What happens when they don't win? What's the mental toll that this takes on these athletes?
It's a good question. And I spoke to Emily before the show, and she highlighted to me how important it was for her to not see the result as the win, but the journey itself.
I really want to do well because I'm very competitive. But I know that if I didn't place or anything, that'd be kind of shit, but I still did the whole challenge. I still did the 22 weeks of dieting, and I still put on lots of muscle in my off season, and I'll do it again. And I'll still have learned a lot from it and picked up some really good habits in my life. And it will be good for me in the long run because I'm just going to do it again. The worst thing is I walk away and all I've done is just learned a whole bunch of things, and that's not a bad thing.
So she's got that positive attitude, but then immediately after the show, so she came out of sixth in her first ever competition. It was tough for her to hide her disappointment.
I felt pretty composed for the first one, which was the most nerve-wracking. But yeah, I don't know. I didn't do very well, so I feel a bit deflated. I'm scared about being competitive, and I feel my physique wasn't competitive at all, so that makes me feel a bit flat.
So after speaking to these experts and Emily, I want to know what you think, Ed. Why do you think people, especially this rise in women, are doing bodybuilding?
That's a big question. I really do think it's case by case. So Emily had a very personal and particular reason for why she wanted to get into this. I think on a macro perspective, you can look at social media and you can look at how accessible it is. But I think from every single person that I spoke to, they had a completely different reason for why that they want to do it. I think from this, there needs to be some sort of education, and maybe regulation is too strong of a word, for the people that are getting into it and understanding their why. Because as Michael said, that is the most important thing. If you get into it for a toxic reason or for an unhealthy reason, then you will find yourself in some trouble.
And I know that a lot of athletes train very hard. They change their bodies and they put a lot of pressure on their bodies for different sports. But as you said, this one does have these ultimate extremes. Do you think that the sport is regulated in a strong enough way to combat body dysmorphia and body eating disorders?
Is there enough regulation? It's a tough question to answer. The way I would describe Australian bodybuilding at the moment is probably just the Wild West. There's 7 to 8 different federations across Australia, some tested, some untested. Whether they're tested or untested, there's very little regulation. I could start a federation if I really wanted to and encourage people to bodybuild and tell them how to do it. And I could tell them how to do it properly, but then they could just do it whichever way that they wanted to anyway. What's coming next, to be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if there's some sort of combination of all of these federations with some sort of government backing to say, this is what we have to do and this is how we do it properly to keep people safe.
And ultimately, do you think it's a good thing that more women are bodybuilding?
I think it depends on the why. That's what I have to go back to. It really depends on the why and it depends on what you want to get out of it. It's a bell curve, essentially. If you're sitting in the right spot, then absolutely. But if you're not, then you might have some trouble.
Thanks so much, Ed, for joining us on The Briefing.
My pleasure.
Listener journalist Ed Gooden there, taking us behind the scenes of competitive bodybuilding. That's it for this episode of The Briefing. We'd love it if you could share this ep with someone you might think will enjoy it as well. And if you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube. Just search for LiSTNR Newsroom. And we'll be back in your feed tomorrow at 6 a.m. I'm Helen Smith. See you next time.